everybody. It is Mike Levin on Saturday, August 1st, 2020 at around 2:20 p.m. and I'm here driving on I-80 East, heading back to Staten Island to pick up my kid, and I turned 50 this month, and you see a little bit of swelling here. I just had a wisdom tooth extracted yesterday. In fact, I had two wisdom. They extract the one above it because it loses function, and it had cracked. Oh, it must have been about a year ago, and it just started to cause me pain. And in my new life now out here in the Poconos, under lockdown, where my schedule is much more flexible, and I have the power of the suburban car in the suburbs. I mean, it's almost rural where I'm at, but I don't have to worry about getting the car out from a garage and then having difficulty parking where I'm going, turning 1 hour appointments into 2 or 3 hour appointments, which was always an issue in New York City. I guess there's also always the subway, but certainly not these days. So with this new freedom, I decided to take care of a bunch of dental work that I had been putting off for years. In fact, I had one chipped tooth that I chipped on some popcorn at 360i, a marketing company I worked for in New York City for quite a few years. And I chipped that tooth back in, it must have been about 2015. So for 5 years, I have been living with what was really a sharp, jagged tooth, because it was a tooth with a crown that chipped, and so the metal of the crown added to the sharpness. And just, how the human body adjusts to new normals, that tooth never hurt me in any other sense than sort of the sharpness sense. Nothing in the roots or anything, no pain. So I put that one off, but when I got in for the wisdom tooth, I decided to get everything done. And today is the day after the extraction. A bunch of the other stuff was done as well. So I'm only just getting used to the new feeling, and there's still the swelling. But I have to tell you, it's almost spiritual, no longer having those abrasive edges in my mouth. When I run my tongue up and down, it's just smooth teeth the way it's supposed to be. And wow, something I put off for far too long. And it's my own fault in the end, as all things are. You look for reasons, you look for excuses, but in the end, I just wasn't taking care of myself well enough. And coming up on 50 years old now, it's really time I start doing that. And with my new situation, it's infinitely easier to do so. You make an appointment, you go, you keep a doctor's or a dentist appointment, you come home, and you use flex hours, such as most people almost automatically have by implication these days who work from home. This is truly an evolution of the human species. We had a very patriarchal or paternal, hierarchical, military type system where you went into work at 9 and you left at 5. Mine was even much worse, because New York marketing hours are really 9 to 6, and there's this always on mentality. And even though I'm in this wonderful organization now, which is really a publisher holding company where we buy up publishing companies and become a larger and larger publisher, which is wonderful for an SEO. For many years, for the majority of the 15 years I was in New York City, I was in agency life, New York marketing agency life. And I was in A-list marketing agencies. I wasn't always at these dinky little things. 360i is an example of where I was at the hottest place in New York City. They're the ones who were like, you can still dunk in the dark tweet during the Super Bowl. I guess it was 2012. I had nothing to do with it, but I was there during that time. And 360i sort of blew up and became one of the darling marketing agencies. And then it became all about creative hot boxes and stuff. And my particular technical brand of SEO became less popular and less important. And I moved on to a number of marketing agencies afterwards where I could be a bigger fish in a smaller pond. Flying Point Digital, which was bought up by Women's Marketing, which has become, I believe it's called Stella. And had a little stint at a place called Acronym, which really builds a lot of its own technology and a lot of its own keyword technology. And so I still hadn't adjusted fully to New York agency life. It wasn't my vibe, my essential vibe. I can do amazing things, but only when I am sort of hands-on, preferably hands-on with the actual technology of the publishing equipment. Back in those days, the actual servers, and these days the cloud servers. But you very rarely have that sort of opportunity. It's more of, advising, being a trusted expert advisor, producing a lot of presentations and talks and PowerPoints, and putting it in the client's hands, maybe tracking whether they implemented your suggestions and sort of pushing them forward. But a lot of times it's like pushing on a rope. And SEO is not necessarily, search engine optimization, by the way, for those who are not familiar with the acronym, is oftentimes the last, or at least one of the lowest priority things for a company to think about with its online publishing endeavors, which is such a shame because it's the best deal in marketing. Merely by virtue of publishing and doing it well, you receive traffic as if you were paying for advertising because Google sends it to you. Perhaps less and less all the time with Google delivering the content more on their site, like ye olde portals. So, boy, so many directions I could go with this talk, but I think I'm going to try and stay on track with what I'm doing right now and what my next steps are in my non-agency life at a publisher, an online publisher, and the evolution of SEO that's going on, right along with the evolution of the workday, the work ethic, business, and this parental hierarchical model that was so the main thing for so many years. Clock punching, time tracking. And there's still a lot of that, don't get me wrong. But a lot more of the responsibility has been put into the individuals or the employees' hands in ways that naysayers had always said, oh, this kind of thing can never work. You have to be in the office. We need to oversee you. You need supervision in order to work well. It's a lack of trust. And, the higher-ups in the hierarchies, the people at the, higher points in those pyramid structures, didn't trust those further down. And there's, oversight and reviews. And while a lot of this is going on still, not nearly as much because there has to be trust. There has to be trust for people to work from home. So you get your work done, you do it at a consistent or even higher quality, and everything is golden. And there's different studies coming out. You can find some studies from Microsoft where productivity might not be the surprise cure-all panacea that we thought it might be. And there's still a fair amount of argument for getting together in person and, as teams. However, the reality of the situation prevents that, and we are all forced to make work this thing that the naysayers doubted and, in fact, prohibited. So the end result is a kind of bullying of the bullies. No, you can't work from home. Oh, well, yes you can. It's almost mandated now. And look at the position those people were in who tried to prevent that or wouldn't allow it. They're eating an awful lot of humble pie. I was in a blessed situation where that was not my situation, and my enlightened boss, when I had to move to Staten Island to be near my kid, allowed me to do quite a bit more telecommuting than I was previously. So I was already into the swing of it while lockdown hit, and I was able to just continue without missing a beat. All my systems were already geared towards working from home. So I'm a Linux, Python, Vim, and Git guy. My actual desktop operating system on a day-to-day basis is Windows, but I use the Windows subsystem for Linux 2. I still have a WSL1 instance installed on my machine. I have so much good stuff to show you. I've gone through this transition over the past 10 or even 15 years now onto Linux and Windows and Python and Vim as my text editor in such a way that I have this spontaneous expertise. I'm spontaneously expressive. I think and I code in Python and Vim for eventual running in Linux scheduling like one talks in the English language. Of course, it oftentimes takes editing when you talk. I don't edit here. But, the spirit really gets across in that when you're trying to accomplish something, you don't have to be as anally retentive, this is the way things are done, kind of person that one would think you had to be based on how subject matter is taught in schools, how the traditional first work experience is, and how the hierarchical advancement through the company levels occurs. Entrepreneurialism is a very big movement these days. When people crack the code, such as it were, they just go to work for themselves. It takes quite a bit more hustle, and I've never really been very fond of that route because all that additional hustle and doing stuff that's really besides the point to the craft never appealed to me. And I've always been something of a student of Peter Drucker, who talked about the information age and the knowledge worker in the information age. We're almost beyond that. We're a generation beyond that now. But Peter Drucker talked a lot about how the modern information worker works for an organization because they have access to all the things that allows them to be productive in their specialty without worrying about all that other stuff. Therefore, working for the man, such as it were, or punching the clock, really is almost the same as working for yourself. You are your own agent. You're working for a client who is your employer, and it just happens to be a paperwork issue and how your taxes are filed and how your health care works that separates the people who work for themselves and hustle from those who punch the clock, especially now during lockdown, where flex hours is a much more by implication kind of thing. A lot of the benefits of working for yourself has come into the life of people who more traditionally had to punch a clock, get to work by a certain time, had to rush to leave by a certain time to meet the kids at home. Now with the kids doing homeschooling, and my kid always was a homeschooler, but you can integrate your life much more. Now, I know plenty of people who have been opposed to life integration. They like this sharp separation between work and home, especially such that work hours do not leak into personal hours, and you don't get that always on feeling and always having to answer that email or that notification vacation, because your boss knows you're going to be there, because where else are you going to be? However, that can all be managed and mitigated, and the people who are complaining about that always on stuff have simply not gone through a few full cycles of refining the process. You don't have to always answer your boss right away unless they say ASAP. And if they say ASAP every time, you might be in the wrong situation. But again, me being blessed the way I am, my boss makes it very clear when things are high priority or not. And in exchange for the occasional having a schedule where I get out to the dentist almost every day of the week for a week, there's a lot of work done. In exchange, I give time at night and during the weekends, and that's flex time. It's something that's been very formal and official at a lot of companies over the years to great effect, acknowledging that people are responsible, that it's not this strict patriarchal, paternal, hierarchical, military-like structure that has to be done for people to be at their best. Giving them a little bit of respect and trust is also a very effective method of bringing out people's best, especially in any situation where people have an opportunity to exercise craft and have the pride of craft and creation in their work. While I was agency side in SEO, that was very much at a minimum. My satisfaction of craft, the master craftsman, the building, the working with your hands, came from making PowerPoint deliverables or Google Slide deliverables, or, basically some bullshit presentation to convince people to have certain behavior. Instead of building systems that compel people to have certain behavior, or to do away with people having to have those behaviors by simply doing the publishing or otherwise tech work yourself. And I have some opportunity to do that kind of stuff, and the pride in craft is starting to come out. I've been at my current employer for quite a few years now, and in tech there's often this tendency to jump around, sometimes over a 2-year cycle, because people question whether you're really going to be bettering yourself and advancing if you stay in the same technical role for more than a certain number of years, and especially when your advancement opportunities are with these management titles that take you out of the very craft you love. They're different things. The craft of real tech, of building something that runs, that interacts with people, that has some property of automation to it, be it a web server, a scheduled task, versus managing people. It's very different. It's a walrus and carpenter issue. And it took me a very long time. Here I am 50, and I'm still, in many people's eyes, and the type of job I have what would be a young man's type job. However, the technology, techniques, tricks, all tech is tricks, my last video, the tricks that I'm able to bring to bear are considerably more and more diverse, and are of the work smarter, not harder variety than most other young folks. You'll find a certain infatuation with the sexy bits of tech these days, things like React.js and all the JavaScript full stack development stuff. And to me, that's the siren song. Been there, done that. I was doing all the Ajax-y, asynchronous, front-end, back-end, full web stack. Before there was a Node.js, I was doing it with Rico.js with Active Server Page, a library that was built on Prototype.js, stuff that dates back to like the 1990s, 99, certainly the early 2000s. And I was doing it when it was all, not very high-level libraries. There was still a lot of low-level stuff going on. And there was no Bootstrap. There was no Twitter Bootstrap JS. So you did everything by hand. And I feel so much been there, done that. And it really dates back to the Amiga. It dates back to the, 1989, 1990, 91, where I did a lot of this stuff without the internet or the web per se, but I did it in multimedia with scripting files for video presentations and interactive touchscreen stuff. And I'm just so fatigued and tired of it. And over the years, I've been more and more attracted to what they call back-end development, the stuff where you don't have to worry about the interaction with humans, because everything is simple. In tech, there's all this stuff. Everything is simple until you have to ... fill in the blank. Use regular expressions, use asynchronous programming principles, and doing front-end user interface work is one of those things. It's a huge violation of the 80-20 rule, because to slam out the first version of something is always the 20% of the effort, but refining it into what people really want, to what makes all the nice difference, is the remaining 80% of the work, which feels materially no more than the first round of work you put in, except you have to work out all the subtleties and nuance. Backend has some of that, but not nearly as much so. Now, when I started out in back-end development work, wow, TCL, I was a TCL person, Tickle, sort of like a Python before Python, a lot of list processing, a lot of automation. TCL, Tickle. Then there was, I was Perl for a little bit. I was a classic, full LAMP stack developer, although not really so much, because I more kicked the tires and started using Microsoft SQL Server in connection with the Active Server page for, I guess, the IIS SQL Server stack, as opposed to the LAMP stack, just because of the day and age that it was. And then Oracle bought MySQL, and NoSQL databases started becoming popular, and I was like, NoSQL, I just call that the DBM database built into Unix/Linux, the Berkeley DB. And, I eventually,
in 2 miles, take exit 43 for I-287 South Morristown South.
Okay, I realized that Active Server Page's future was over. It was a product with an end of life, end of support. It's not where the cool stuff was going on. And all this expertise, all this knowledge, all this know-how, all this muscle memory that I developed on my text editor, Edit Plus at the time, before that PFE, and it just got undone. The giant undo button was pressed on it. And that's a recurring theme in technology. The giant undo button is always going to be pressed on you, because, technology is tricks. Technology, tech is tricks. Tech is text. Mastering text files is mastering tech. Even if it's compiled stuff eventually, it goes from plain text to compiled. So any way you slice it, the better you can move around those text file bits and text files, the better you are at tech, and the better you are at tricks. And this was...
In half a mile, take exit 43 for I-287 South, Morristown South.
So long to truly realize and internalize. And I had this cognitive dissonance. I had this very...
Take exit 43, then keep right at the fork.
Big division or break in my head, because I realized that even though there was this text commonality to all tech,
keep right at the fork,
there were particular text editors you had to choose, or IDEs, integrated development environments, where you learned their macros, you learned their keyboard shortcuts.
In 2 miles, use the left 2 lanes to take exit 47A for I-280 East toward the Oranges, Newark.
Position of things on the drop-down menu for the mouse, and you got very at one with your text editor. PFE and Edit Plus were not the first ones I came to that sort of Zen oneness with. It was Cygnus Editor on the Amiga, CED, before that. And with AREX, some programming languages I forgot to mention that I achieved that Zen level with. AREX on the Amiga, which was a port of the Rex program from the IBM days. And it was a port by a friend of mine, Michael Sins. I still know the guy, and, you know, heart all his wonderful Facebook posts all the time. He's got a beautiful house with horses and daughter, and it's just, he's living this. Oh, and he worked on the Microsoft Midori project, so he's someone who really knows the heartbreak of sinking yourself into stuff and it going away. And he was one of the first ones who, when I expressed losing all this specialness of the Amiga as being devastating to me, he goes, oh, go on to other stuff.
In half a mile, use the left 2 lanes to take exit 47A for I-280 East toward the Oranges, Newark.
There could be nothing after the Amiga, and it's like a Stradivarius violin. People who were there with me know what I'm talking about, but the Amiga was such a fine-tuned instrument, but for...
Use the left 2 lanes to take exit 47A.
Frequent crashing and lack of memory management, it was a profoundly...
Continue for 13 miles.
...cool machine that you could get at Total One with, achieve that Zen, and have that spontaneous expertise, which I've been seeking for all the rest of my life since, and thought that I found it again with Edit Plus an active server page and Microsoft technology and SQL Server. That went away too. And so I went on this language hunt, and it was before Node.js. So I was finding things like JavaScript on the server with a unsupported technology called Rhino, the Firefox JavaScript engine, the Firefox equivalent in those days of the Google V8 engine, which became the heart of Node.js. They call it something else now. But I quickly discounted JavaScript on the server as my back-end technology, in addition to it not being highly supported at that time, because before then it was, active server page. JavaScript was one of the 2 languages, VB Scripting Edition, Visual Basic Scripting Edition, or VB Script was the other language that worked under active server page. And before that, there was Netscape Server, so people think JavaScript on the server and full web stack development is a new thing. It's as old as the web. One of the first web servers that could do commerce stuff, Netscape Commerce Server, was JavaScript. So over the years, I really had tried and attempted to take it up, and had a lot of bitterness over JavaScript. The fragmentation that seems to plague it. And that fragmentation can still be seen today in the forms of React.js versus everything else. Angular is out of style, React is in style, and then they have all this stuff next to JS to accommodate for all these shortcomings of JavaScript libraries, the ability to create static files for performance, to be SEO friendly. But now, to take advantage of that, you need this very, very deep, intimate knowledge of a framework that's bound to just go obsolete on you someday. Front-end development work sucks. And so, is back-end development work without JavaScript any better? And of course, I'm leading up to my discovery of Python. And Python itself is a framework. You might not think so, but there are so many frameworks under Python because it already satisfies the 80-20 rule of frameworks. It is the 20% of the work to give you 80% of all possible frameworks that you need, and you're only doing the final mile type stuff to turn Python into some specialized framework. Flask is a wonderful example. When Python added this operation called decorators, this function or capability called decorators, that allowed functions to work like URL responders. It's hard to even describe, but Python did a few of these things that was like sprinkling magic fairy dust in to enable countless more very web-friendly frameworks to be built on Python, such that even though Python is plagued by so many frameworks, especially on the back end, the way JavaScript is plagued with frameworks on the front end, but you invest your time into knowing just plain old Python, and it serves you super well for the rest of your life. I guess the same can sort of be said for JavaScript, but JavaScript, the building up of things into the components you need, is so much heavy work and lifting, kind of like it is in C, that the first thing you really do is reach for one of these frameworks. Now, in all fairness, on Python, you do that too in things as simple as making HTTP calls. You reach for things like the requests framework from Kenneth Wright's, but you don't have to. You can learn URL lib, you can do it all natively, and it's in there. Python is batteries included. And getting these frameworks is oftentimes, it doesn't even feel like getting a framework. You do this pip install, and then the features of the language are extended. It's almost like just new features are added to Python. You can use decorators that allow you to do web server routing for page requests, as it is with Flask and Cherry Pie and a ton of others. Pylons. There's a whole bunch of nuanced differences between these frameworks, and you choose your different Python frameworks for your nuanced differences, but making the switch from Cherry Pie to Flask to Pylons is like a non-issue. Everything is going to look and feel and be almost exactly the same, but for the nuance that gives you special advantages of some sort. Like Pylons gives you a lot of, static speed advantages and all that scaffolding framework stuff that Ruby on Rails gives you. There's also Django, the granddaddy of all frameworks on Python, which has so much nuance and customizability that it really is as much learning and specialization as a JavaScript front-end framework. But you know what? I keep away from Django. I don't need it. You can choose much more lightweight things and have just much more moving parts. And the Python community and landscape is such that even the Django people know that, and then they create super lightweight versions of Django so you can still use their custom APIs, because these packages are really all about custom API extensions, application program interfaces, again, for the people who are not familiar with the acronyms. And they add capabilities to the language, and they add new API rules to the language. Another fine example, where am I going with this? Okay, so Python backend development. I had an awful lot of superpowers from previous tools that went obsolete. I had a lot of superpowers from previous tools that didn't go to obsolete but are now terribly out of context based on who I'm working for and my role in the company, and that is SQL. Now, whereas if I were to cajole and convince the holders to the keys of the kingdom of mission-critical systems that I should have SQL access to their systems, I could certainly get it. I'm good enough at this stuff and able to demonstrate my abilities and restraint, such that I even know to do things to ask for, accounts on just the reporting layer, so that I can't even do damage except for maybe make the reporting layer of a database system get tied up a little longer than maybe maybe it otherwise would by running one of my jobs. But I can't screw the pooch on the data. I can't corrupt data. It's impossible to corrupt the data, really, when you have select-only access on the reporting layer of a database system, because there's more than one databases in the picture. There's one which is doing all the inserts and all the work that will change the contents of the database based on the user's actions. And then there's all kinds of methods to make a mirror image, transaction logs. There's all kinds of ways you can make a mirror image of that database where you can't do the updates. And that's very typical. And in my old life, I would get usually select only access to SQL. And then you are now dealing with all the vendor implementation nuances of SQL. SQL is not just SQL. There's Transact SQL from Microsoft that works one way. There's Oracle SQL. There's Postgres SQL, which is also Amazon Redshift SQL. And they all have these subtle differences. And, it's kind of like the vendor dependency game. And it's all that stuff that I tried to get away from. Now, whereas SQL won't be going away, and active server page isn't really going away either, but SQL is never going to become unsupported the way active server page might someday. It's unsupported maybe from a Microsoft standpoint, but plenty of people move in to support that business because so many things are published in that old way. But to avoid ever getting into that situation, I look for much more technology agnostic approaches where there are never .asp things or extensions of any sort in your published stuff. This is a trick that Ruby on Rails had adopted early on. So you can switch from one technology to another and your published URLs never change, which is such a critical key part for SEO. You never want your URLs to change and have to undergo redirection because it loses something each time it does that. You want your published URLs to stay the same over the years, so that brings you to a certain technology agnostic approach, a desire for certain technology agnostic approach on the publishing layer. However, I have very much sought that out on the back end layer, and you might say Python is not technology agnostic, it's Python. Well, all that SQL stuff becomes generic because the Pandas library, a third-party library that was created by a company that was called, Pandas. Okay, I forget who developed Pandas, but Pandas is now packaged by a company that was once called Continuum.io, now called Anaconda, in a package called Anaconda that gets all this SQL-like stuff onto your system in a technology agnostic way. Dare I say Python.
In half a mile, keep right to stay on I-280 East.
Is technology agnostic SQL. Okay? So, for people like me, who are mostly concerned with select only or reporting access to databases.
Keep right to stay on I-280 East.
Other stuff, it's very capable of doing the full CRUD, create, report, update, delete functions of more traditional.
Continue on I-280 East for 3 miles.
But for that, you'd employ things like SQL Alchemy and interact with real SQL data. Well, you'd interact in real SQL. But Python abstracts a lot of that away, but gives you all the power. I say Python. The Pandas library for Python abstracts a lot of that away and gives you a very Pythonic API to SQL, whether SQL is there or not. It's really quite amazing. Pull data down from anywhere, and you can do all your joins and your unions and your intersects and your filters and your transforms. So I got back all that secret weapon stuff that I thought I lost by not being on the database team, by not being a DBA, by not being perhaps an analyst, or all these other types of job roles where using SQL on very customized instances of SQL products. Something to talk about there. So when you're into databases and you're a database person and you become valuable at a company for your knowledge and ability on a database, you're talking about a particular instance of a database for your employer of that vendor. So the database is a particular database from a particular vendor like Oracle or Microsoft, or one of the open source ones like Postgres. And all the table structures and the entity relationships and the constraints and the business rules and logic that surround it are incredibly customized for that particular instance to do that work, that necessary work for that company, for that employer. And you as an employee become extremely keyed to that situation. And that's way more specific, vendor dependent, job dependent, and the opposite of generic than I always look for now in my technology, so that the reset button is not always hit on me. Now the story doesn't begin and end at Python pandas, because pandas is just one of a array of stuff, dare I say array for the pun, because pandas is just the one to deal with relational database, RDBMS type data, rows and columns, matrices, rocket science, things that
In half a mile, keep left to stay on I-280 East.
Heavy duty number crunching, and not ragged array stuff or NoSQL stuff, key value pair stuff. So within the database world, your data can either be...
Keep left to stay on I-280 East.
rows and columns.
Continue on I-280 East for 3/4 of a mile.
Connected to the Excel world, for example, where your tabs in Excel are rows and columns. Each tab has rows and columns. And that...
In half a mile, take the exit on the left toward Turnpike.
Reminiscent, reflective of the relational database approach, SQL. So very often applications start out in Excel and they move to SQL. And people are these Excel gurus putting all this time into forcing this vendor-specific product, which is not very suited for these tasks, especially where a lot of data is involved, forcing it to do all this stuff.
Take the exit on the left toward Turnpike, then keep right at the fork.
And causes you to do all this hunt and
Keep
peck
right at the
stuff,
fork.
all through these spreadsheets, knowing special locations.
Continue on I-95 South for 3 miles.
All this specialized knowledge, very little documentation. You can't read it from top to bottom like a story, like you can with programming code. And they put all this programming work into Excel, where they could just do a little programming. Now, if they did a little programming, the common knowledge is you go to some sort of database. An Excel person would very frequently go to Microsoft Access or even SQL Server Personal, to sort of use what you know, to use the documentation that's all around you, to use the high confidence.
In 2 miles, use the left 2 lanes to take the Turnpike South exit.
Versions of things, and that leads you down this path of vendor dependency, Microsoft dependency in this case, until you fall into that same trap I did, until you're doing some form of Microsoft web development, maybe C# connecting to a database, usually SQL Server, to publish using IIS or some version of that. Other paths will bring you to free and open source things, where you might do some sort of publishing on, let's say, Flask using SQLite as the database backend, a whole free and open source stack. And even to me, as I verbalize that, it's all very appealing. SQLite, or SQLite, as some people call it, is incredibly awesome and versatile. It doesn't have as many features as expensive databases, but it's included with Python and other programming languages. And the database files it makes can be just transported between platforms. There's a data portability advantage of SQLite. And as much as I love SQLite and really working in native SQL, select something from something where something equals something, I like working in Python pandas more. And so, when
In half a mile, use the left 2 lanes to take the Turnpike South exit.
Much more advanced than you can do in Excel, my common knowledge or advice these days would be to
Use the left 2 lanes to take the Turnpike South exit, then merge onto I-95 South.
For Python, and learn to do all those same selects and under pandas with the pandas API. It's significantly different than the SQL API. You can do mostly all the same things, but whereas SQL reads like this English rambling stuff without necessarily...
Continue on I-95 South for 6 miles.
Or, without clean structure really built in. You have to sort of invent it on your own, the same way curly bracket people do in curly bracket languages like C and JavaScript. In Python, pandas is highly enforced. It sounds bad, but a highly enforced structured API, which just becomes so much easier to read and so much easier to kind of work spontaneously and expressively in. And everything you learn is cross-platform. There are no subtle, nuanced differences of using pandas against Oracle, or pandas against SQL Server, or pandas against Postgres, the way there is with SQL. You have to learn all that SQL stuff, and when SQL falls short, you have to use all this vendor-specific technology, like it's built-in functions. And people talk about the functions built into SQL like it's just, use SQL functions. It's not true. Everything that's a function in SQL is some specific vendor implementation. It's not generic. So all the database stuff, all the secret weapon stuff that I was really adept at in the past has come back to me again in my now old age, midlife crisis. I'm like a super database programmer again, thanks to the whole Pythonic approach to things. And that's just one example. Python pandas brought back SQL-type superpowers to me. I find myself needing to do much less web development work in general because Python scripts thrown into a scheduler, creating some sort of output that I can just email to people, or update a Google spreadsheet, a Google Docs, a Google Sheet, is a much better solution. You don't have to do any of this front-end development work. As soon as the demands of the data you're updating in Google Sheets becomes extreme, like you have to add this and that capability because your stakeholders demand it, you're better off going back to some sort of web development. And, I won't speak to that much on this video, but suffice to say, what I'm doing is advocating a true 80-20 rule to all things tech, by employing the best tricks that give you 80% of the benefit of what you're looking for with the first upfront 20% of your effort. The 80-20 rule just asks that you should start to plan your tasks so when you're only 1/5 done, you could have stopped and still have won. And when you're that 1/5 or 20% of the way into your work, and you have most of it the way you want, and all the subtlety and nuance comes out, and you realize this and you realize that, and the 80% of the work that still remains on your project is sprung upon you.
In 2 miles, take exit 13 for I-278 toward Elizabeth Goethals Bridge.
By intelligent selection of Python third-party libraries to pip install. And you do this all under a touchy-feely, very soft, fuzzy blue circle environment called Jupyter Labs, which gets installed as part of Jupyter Notebook, as part of the Anaconda install, which gets installed right along with Pandas and scikit-learn and all this other stuff. Now, a lot of it's part of the standard Python public library or standard library, but a lot of it isn't. Pandas isn't, Jupyter Notebook isn't. So all these tools that turn Python into this fuzzy feeling things out by trying things in a REPL run eval print loop. Your code is never quite done running. It's better than an IDE for learning Python. Now there's this whole debate and split because Microsoft saw all this going on in the Python work, and in a desperate scramble made VS Code. They embraced the whole free and open source world and are trying to use the tools of the free and open source world to make sure that your tool stack is completely free and open source and completely Microsoft dependent. And that is VS Code. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about as the benefits of the Jupyter Labs and Jupyter Notebook stack, tool chain, set of things that get installed with Anaconda, Microsoft makes sure you get with VS.
In a quarter mile, take exit 13 for I-278 toward Elizabeth Goethals Bridge.
Good integrity and conscience steer you away from VS Code, and by all means use it, have that experience. But see what Jupyter Labs is like in the web browser after an
Take exit 13.
All the best tricks that get you up and running and productive fast can be done with really zero.
Continue for 3/4 of a mile.
Even though I do it on a Windows 10 platform, I do it under the Windows subsystem for Linux in such a way that all my knowledge and know-how, all my tricks are timeless, and I am obsolescence proof. I do things in an old school fashion that is always relevant and applicable and always makes...
In a quarter mile, keep left at the fork. Follow signs for I-278 East, Staten Island.
To have a seat at the table. Your approach is valid when you do things the way I advocate, unless there is a closed-minded, dogmatic adherence or adoption of vendor-specific solutions. So you will find that VS Code bias everywhere, tremendously, with overwhelming force these days. And for good reason. Microsoft did a good job.
Keep left at the fork.
VS Code, which is not Visual Studio.net, which is not...
Continue on I-278 East for 8 miles.
...proprietary IDE that many Microsoft-specific software developers use, but rather it is one that adopts its identity in a much more lightweight product called VS Code, Visual Studio Code, which is in fact a free and open source project. So, you know, they counteract that big argument that people like me make. It's definitely open source, but is it free and open source? It's free and open source in the same way that everything else is that has proprietary bits in it, like drivers. The way Ubuntu is free and open source, but it supports all this hardware because there's binary proprietary bits. Raspberry Pi does the same thing. And everything that is built on free and open source that brings best in class, best of breed to you in some way is doing that same trick of having these little bits that are proprietary, written in some other language, often compiled. And VS Code or is even just proprietary, intellectual property, whereas this chunk is not. It's truly free and open source. But this other chunk is under a different license, which gives you the expanded capabilities. That's the case with Android, where if you want Android on a mobile phone, you can do a complete free and open source of Android, but as soon as you want Google services, the Google Play Store and all that stuff, Gmail integration and all that G Suite integration, no longer free and open source, but deeply proprietary as much as Microsoft. Licensing fees needing to be paid. So I can't steer you away from all that is proprietary. Proprietary is good and yummy and power tools and lets you get done more in less time and allows you access to the best hardware. I'm on the Microsoft Surface Pro 2. They're up to the 3 now, but it's not the Surface, it's the Surface Pro laptop, which in my opinion, up until the Surface Pro 3 came out, was the best laptop on the market. There's no billionaire out there that was on better hardware than I was. I might need to update, but I might try and squeeze all the value out of it as I can, and maybe experiment with something different. But I am very much a dandy about my hardware. I'll pay the extra amount, I'll go proprietary, because I want the muscle memory of my fingers on those keyboards to be timeless. I used to be on these keyboards like the Microsoft Model M buckling spring keyboard because it's a timeless keyboard, because it's always going to be kept alive. Because when IBM stopped making them, a company bought the factory from IBM to continue making it. I think it's called Unicomp, because it's such a delightful keyboard and there's so many people who are addicted to using it and have that muscle memory for it that it just doesn't go away. However, it's loud and it's rude to the people around you. And before lockdown, I stopped using buckling spring keyboards because it was impolite to the people around me, right? And I finally got won over by the low-profile keyboards, as were, made popular by extremely good implementations of them by Apple. And I loved my Apple Airbooks. A huge MacBook Air fan. I still have one that I use to this day. It does screen recording with Screencast and VMware, better even than my Surface Pro 2 with Camtasia Studio. Mac is just awesome, and their hardware is awesome, and but Microsoft surpassed them lately with hardware, and their low-profile keyboards were sufficient that I was willing to allow myself to develop my muscle memory on these keyboards. And if I switch to anything other than the Surface Book 3 as my next computer, I'm going to be very specific about getting a very similar type, high-quality, low-profile keyboard with the keys in the same general location. And the battle over operating systems and proprietary stuff can be seen almost nowhere better than the placement of the operating system key and the functioning of the control versus the alt key. One of the most horrible things that Apple ever did to tech was reversing the function of the control and the alt key. And it's almost enough reason right there to keep away from the whole Apple platform, because I'm never really using this awesome hardware, be it Apple or Microsoft, for the Mac OS or Windows hardware platform. I'm using it to get to a very Unix-like environment in the case of Mac, or a very Linux-like environment in the case of Microsoft. And these days it is in fact Unix, and always has been since OS X on Apple, on Macintosh, but as of recently is actually Linux on Microsoft. And there's a huge transition in the industry, an evolution of the industry going on. Evolution of work from home, and now evolution of the whole developer and tech industry by Microsoft including the Linux kernel with all Windows 10 now, such that getting genuine Ubuntu running perfectly good for development work in an uncompromising, genuine Linux way that is appealing to me and people like me, it's just there. And to get started with Python on any platform now, Microsoft, Apple, or other Linux desktop, you can just install Anaconda and use Jupyter Notebook or Jupyter Labs through a web browser, and that's my recommended way to get started. However, the idea is to go to some more generic Linux environment for running your code, which is generic.
In 2 miles, take exit 15 toward Fingerboard Road, Lily Pond Avenue.
And the stuff I'm teaching you, but on the way to generic cloud servers, it goes through running locally on your Windows machine on Linux under WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux. So your code goes from Jupyter Notebook, platform independent Jupyter Notebook stuff, truly platform independent. You might make that argument with VS Code and PY files these days, but notebook files are something special on Jupyter Notebook because they can run on Jupyter Notebook, which is ported to everything and has no vendor dependency, and has all these great advantages for a newbie who's trying to get started. Also, under the Windows platform, if you just open any old CMD or PowerShell and just type the word Python, it'll start to install the latest, greatest, genuine Python from the Microsoft Store and keep it updated, giving you another super wonderful context for running Python in more of that automated .py file way that developers are more comfortable with. But what I'm going to teach you is, on any platform you're on, going from those Python notebooks that you create under Jupyter Labs from the Anaconda install, to going to generic Linux and then generic Linux scheduling. And that's pretty much it. That's like this next generation.
In half a mile, take exit 15 toward Fingerboard Road, Lily Pond Avenue.
And old school is always relevant and always gives you a seat at the table, keeps you from being obsolete, allows you to understand things at a much deeper level than your contemporaries who are, falling in love with and marrying themselves.
Take exit 15, then merge onto Narrows Road South.
Which are only going to get them into the, giant reset button being hit on them every 5 to 10 years. A developer named Joel Spolsky used to talk about this as
Continue on Narrows Road South for half a mile.
Every time you make an advance, you lose that same amount of ground by the developers changing the tools on you. And he used to really hate Microsoft in the way they did this, even though he was a Microsoft employee, Joel Spolsky. And when .NET came around, they really did the job on him, swinging him back to being pro-Microsoft. However, I'm pro-Microsoft now too. Not the proprietary stuff, but they see the writing on the wall. They know that they have to be a free and open source software company now. And they empower developers to work the way they want to work, and very aligned to my way of working now. So I get to be on yummy Microsoft hardware.
In 800 feet, use the right 2 lanes to turn right onto Lily Pond Avenue.
Of the free and open source stack software, and I get to program in languages and environments that I actually love. They are love-worthy. All that stuff I fell in love with about the Amiga platform as that finely tuned strategy.
Use the right 2 lanes to turn right onto Lily Pond Avenue.
I find also as well now in Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. And in thinking about my shtick, I might even simplify it more when I talk to you, the public, on my YouTube channels and stuff. Linux, Python, Vim, and Git is all well and good, but it's really about life. like the way I started out this video.
Continue for 3/4 of a mile.
Living a nice integrated life. I don't draw those sharp lines of division between work and home. I love what I do. I see no reason to insulate my wife and my kid from it. I'll give them the ability to have six-figure jobs if they want to have it by being a generic plumber of tech type thing. You hear it all the time, generic tech plumbing. Well, mastering Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, well, you can't master it all. Each one of those has too much to it to master. But to master enough of each to work competently and to, be able to be a contributor in any situation is a worthy goal, a worthy capability to have. And I highly recommend it. So it's life. And instead of going right to Python, I would say Linux, because I get to use the L's, life, Linux, and that love-worthiness bit, right? Life, Linux, and love, right? That's what I'm going to sort of promote. I'll probably make that the title of this video. An hour of rambling about life, Linux, and love. Thanks for joining me. Hope to talk to you again soon. And don't forget to subscribe.